The war behind the war, okay? Let's begin with the scene that everybody saw and almost nobody really examined. Yesterday evening, June 11th, 2026, President Donald Trump stepped in front of the cameras and delivered a statement that hit global markets like an electric shock. He said, quote, "We ended the war with Iran today. They have agreed never to have a nuclear weapon. We got everything we wanted." And instantly the reaction was explosive. Wall Street surged, the Dow jumped, the Nasdaq ripped higher, investors relaxed. Television networks broke into coverage. Red banners flashed across every screen. Deal reached. War over. Trump wins. That was the story. That was the headline. That was the image projected onto the wall. And then, less than 3 hours later, Iran's foreign ministry came forward and said something devastating in its simplicity. They said Iran had not yet reached a final conclusion on any agreement. That one sentence changed the entire picture. Suddenly, the celebration looked premature. Suddenly, the certainty looked staged. Suddenly, the world was forced to confront a pattern that has become impossible to ignore. Because this was not the first time. According to Iranian reporting, figures close to Tehran's information apparatus have tracked repeated public declarations that some major breakthrough was imminent, that the war was about to end, that negotiations were on the edge of success. They counted them. The number they reached before yesterday was 38. Yesterday, if that count is fair, was number 39. Now, most commentators immediately ask the obvious question, is this time different? Is this deal real? Is this finally the off-ramp? Or is it just another false alarm? Those are reasonable questions, but they are not the most important questions. The question I want to ask is deeper than that. Why does Trump keep doing this? Why repeatedly announce victory before the structure of victory actually exists? Why declare closure before closure is confirmed? And just as importantly, why does Iran keep allowing the cycle to continue? Why not crush the narrative instantly, every single time, with a total and humiliating denial? Because once you start asking those questions, the conflict begins to look very different. What I want to argue is this. The struggle between the United States and Iran is not only, or even mainly, being decided by bombs, missile defense systems, fighter jets, or naval blockades. Those things matter. Of course they matter. People are dying. Infrastructure is being destroyed. Ships are being rerouted. Markets are reacting. The kinetic war is real. But the decisive arena may be somewhere else. This war is being fought in the realm of perception, in expectation, in fatigue, in fear, in political patience. In other words, the real battlefield is the human mind. And once you see that, a lot of things that look irrational suddenly become strategic. So let me give you the concept that unlocks the rest of this analysis. The concept is cognitive warfare. Cognitive warfare is very simple in definition and extremely complex in consequence. Traditional war tries to degrade your enemy's capacity. You destroy asset supply lines, command nodes, runways, ports, depots, radar networks. Cognitive warfare aims at something else. It aims at the stories people believe, the emotional climate they live in, the interpretation they assign to events, and ultimately the willingness of a society to continue paying the price of conflict. You do not merely attack the enemy's infrastructure. You attack the enemy's confidence in its own strategy. You attack its ability to sustain consent. You attack morale, legitimacy, trust, and the feeling that the road ahead leads anywhere except deeper cost. And to understand why that matters, I want you to go back thousands of years. Think about Plato's cave. A group of prisoners is chained in such a way that they can only face a wall. Behind them burns a fire. Between the fire and the prisoners, others move objects so that shadows are cast onto the wall in front of them. The prisoners cannot turn around. They cannot inspect the source. They cannot examine the mechanism. To them, the shadows are reality. Now, Plato's philosophical question is famous. What is truth? What is illusion? What happens when someone leaves the cave and comes back with a different understanding of what is real? But in political terms, there is another question, maybe the most important one. Who controls the shadows? Who decides what appears on the wall? For most of the modern era, powerful states and large media institutions held that privilege. Governments issued statements. Major broadcasters repeated them. Newspapers interpreted them. Experts reinforced them. The public, with varying degrees of skepticism, lived inside those frames. That system has not disappeared, but it has fractured. And what Iran appears to understand is that in the age of algorithmic media, social platforms, synthetic imagery, and instant emotional contagion, a weaker state does not need air superiority to project shadows into the enemy's cave. It can send them directly into the phones of millions of people. That is a revolution. Iran does not need to destroy every American carrier group. It does not need to defeat the Pentagon in a symmetrical military contest. It does not even need to convince most Americans that Iran is right. That is not the objective. The objective is smaller and more realistic. Make enough Americans doubt the value, direction, and winnability of the conflict that the political foundation underneath the war begins to crack. If the public asks, why are we still doing this? Long enough, loudly enough, and at the right moment, then the strategic effect may equal what missiles could not achieve. That is cognitive warfare. Now let's talk about the mechanisms. Weapon number one is synthetic media, generative AI, manipulated imagery, staged visual narratives, deepfake adjacent content, and emotionally engineered clips designed to outrun verification. This matters because images are not just information. Images are neurological events. Once an image triggers fear, outrage, humiliation, disgust, or dread, rational correction becomes much weaker than most people think. A fact check may later inform you that the clip was fabricated, that the explosion was composited, that the soldiers were not real, that the surrender footage was synthetic, that the mushroom cloud above an American skyline was never authentic. But the nervous system does not cleanly reverse itself just because a caption was added later. The emotional mark remains. The image is already inside memory. The body has already reacted. The subconscious has already absorbed a possibility and filed it under danger. That is the whole trick. Iran, or actors aligned with Iran, do not need every fake image to be believed literally. Literal belief is not even the most important metric. What matters is cumulative mood. What matters is the creation of a shared mental atmosphere. What matters is whether a population starts to feel, in a vague but spreading way, that events are slipping, that escalation is dangerous, that humiliation is possible, that this could spiral, that this could become endless. You do not need mass conviction. You need ambient anxiety. And once ambient anxiety enters the political bloodstream, the feedback loop begins. Citizens scroll late at night and see apocalyptic content. Fear spreads faster than context. Comment sections radicalize emotion. Politicians begin to sense vulnerability in the public mood. Reporters start asking harder questions. Allies become more visibly uneasy. Markets swing. The White House feels pressure to calm the atmosphere. The president then has an incentive. China's position is fascinating because it combines public restraint with strategic opportunism. On the surface, Beijing speaks the language of stability. It calls for calm. It warns about disruption. It expresses concern over supply chains, energy routes, and global uncertainty. It performs the role of the sober power that prefers de-escalation. And there is truth in that. Chaos does impose risk on China. But geopolitics is not about whether an event creates risk. It is about who is best positioned to convert that risk into leverage. And China may be uniquely positioned to do exactly that. Consider the energy dimension. If Middle Eastern instability pushes global prices upward, many import-dependent economies suffer immediately. Yet China operates with a different strategic cushion because Russia, constrained by sanctions and narrowed market access, has strong incentives to keep Chinese demand satisfied. That gives Beijing bargaining power others do not have. In plain terms, when a supplier has fewer places to go, the buyer gains leverage. So the same conflict that raises costs for some competitors may simultaneously deepen China's negotiating advantage with Russia. That is not a minor side effect. That is an industrial advantage. Now, add the broader dependency structure. When one major power becomes more reliant on another for trade channels, components, financing flexibility, and diplomatic oxygen, the relationship changes. It becomes less a partnership of equals and more a hierarchy masked by ceremony. China understands this perfectly. It does not need to humiliate Russia publicly. It only needs to keep extracting favorable terms quietly. And then there is Iran. By shielding Tehran diplomatically where useful, while still presenting itself as a responsible advocate of peace, Beijing accumulates influence without assuming the direct costs of warfighting. That is a remarkable position. You preserve channels with Iran, maintain economic leverage over Russia, and still keep diplomatic space open with the West by emphasizing stability and trade. This is what sophisticated statecraft looks like, not loud triumph, optionality. China's great advantage here is that it does not need to win the public narrative in the American media ecosystem. It does not need to reassure Congress. It does not need to answer for every strike. It does not need to own the chaos. It can let others absorb the heat while it studies price movements, bargaining asymmetries, sanctions leakages, and long-term dependency shifts. That is why the real strategic winner of a conflict is not always one of the combatants. Sometimes the winner is the actor who lets others spend blood, legitimacy, and attention while it collects structural gains. Now, let's bring everything together. If this framework is even partially correct, then what we are watching is not just a military contest with an information sideshow. We are watching a multi-layered conflict in which information pressure, emotional engineering, public fatigue, diplomatic ambiguity, and third-party opportunism all interact. Iran's strategy, as it appears from this lens, has three broad pillars. First, shape the emotional climate. Use images, narratives, symbolic incidents, and repeated uncertainty to create a cognitive environment in which Americans feel that the war is unstable, costly, and potentially unwinnable, regardless of tactical battlefield advantages. Second, move the political middle. Do not waste effort trying to convert hardened supporters or hardened opponents. Target the movable center. Make ordinary voters feel that continued escalation threatens their economic security, moral comfort, and trust in leadership. Third, exploit framing weakness. Every time the United States relies on fast, episodic claims of competence, Search for the incident that can puncture that frame. One mistake magnified at the right time may do more political damage than a dozen battlefield losses. Now look at the effects such a strategy would aim to produce. A president who keeps announcing closure before closure exists. Allies who become visibly restless. Legislators who question legality, duration, or strategic clarity. Markets that surge on hope and sink on contradiction. A public that becomes less interested in winning than in ending. If that is happening, then Iran does not need a conventional victory parade to claim success. It only needs to make continuation politically harder for Washington. Then, endurance is for Tehran. And over all of this sits China, patient and disciplined, translating chaos into leverage. So what should you watch next? Watch the language, not just the headlines. If Iranian officials continue using formulations that leave room without granting closure, that suggests they believe ambiguity still serves them. Watch whether any memorandum, framework, or interim arrangement gets formalized in binding terms rather than celebratory rhetoric. Watch Israel, because one of the least discussed truths in any regional negotiation is that Washington cannot perfectly control every actor whose calculations shape escalation. Watch oil, watch insurance, watch shipping patterns. Markets often reveal stress before spokespeople admit it. And above all, watch Beijing's tone. Because if China ever shifts from generalized concern to more active pressure for stabilization, that may indicate something very important, that the strategic value of chaos has begun to decline relative to the commercial value of reopening the system. When the outside beneficiary decides disorder is no longer profitable, that can be a stronger signal than 10 presidential announcements. So let me end with the real question. Suppose an agreement is eventually signed. Suppose Trump stands before cameras and says America forced Iran back, dismantled the threat, restored deterrence, and achieved peace through strength. Suppose Iranian leaders stand before their own cameras and say Iran endured the assault, defended its sovereignty, preserved its core interests, and compelled the enemy to accept limits. Both sides, in that scenario, will tell a politically useful version of events. Both sides will perform victory for domestic consumption. And perhaps both narratives will contain fragments of truth. But performance is not the same as outcome. So ask the harder question. Who exhausted whom? Who altered whose political space? Who paid the visible cost? And who captured the invisible leverage? Who fought? Who endured? Who manipulated perception more effectively? And who sat far enough from the flames to profit from the fire? Because once you ask that question, power looks very different. It is not only in carriers, warheads, sanctions, or air defense maps. Power is also in timing, in narrative discipline, in emotional calibration, in patience, in knowing when to speak, when to delay, when to deny, when to let your enemy overstate, and when to quietly cash in while the table symbol is still noisy. That is the war behind the war. And until people understand that battlefield, they will keep misreading what these announcements really are. They are not always conclusions. Sometimes they are symptoms. Sometimes they are attempts to stabilize a story that is slipping. Sometimes they are proof that the fight over perception is biting deeper than the fight over territory. And sometimes the loudest claim of victory is the clearest sign that nobody has truly won yet. That is the frame I would use. Challenge it, test it, push against it, try to break it. Because if it survives pressure, it may tell you more about this conflict than another week of breaking news banners ever will. And if it fails, then good.